The final number was on the table, $9 billion. From across the sterile boardroom, Grayson Wolf watched his opponent's resolve crumble, another empire about to be absorbed into his own. Victory was a science, and he was its master. His world was a fortress of calculated outcomes, which is why the vibration from his phone felt so wrong. A silent, urgent security alert. He glanced down at the live feed. There, in his penthouse, his sanctuary, was an anomaly. A hotel maid, standing motionless, looking at a family portrait he hadn't glanced at in years. In his perfectly controlled universe, she was an impossibility. And as the $9 billion deal waited, Grayson realized only one question mattered. Who was she? Grayson Wolf was a man who did not believe in margins of error. To him, the world operated on clear rules, precise algorithms, and predictable outcomes. The CEO of Wolf Dynamics, a billion-dollar empire built on a foundation of absolute precision and iron discipline. Everything in his life, from his investments to his relationships, was calculated for a return. Emotion was an unnecessary variable. So, when he opened his eyes in the luxurious penthouse of the Carlton Hotel and registered the chaos, his world fractured. It wasn't the noise. It was the silence, and a dark red smear on the pristine white sheets. A cold truth pierced his chest. Not fear, not guilt, just a sharp awareness that a protocol had been broken. A foreign variable had entered his perfect equation. Beside him, a small form was curled up, her back to him. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. There was no expensive perfume lingering in the air, no trace of lipstick on the crystal glasses. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible, as if she were trying to dissolve into the sheets themselves. Her dress, crumpled and torn at the hem, lay discarded on the floor near his jacket. A silver tray with untouched champagne and glistening condensed strawberries sat nearby. The scene looked like something from a cheap drama, except it was happening in his reality, and the blood was real. She stirred, a soft whimper of pain escaping her lips. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. And then, she turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, filled with a chaotic mix of fear and shame. Her dark lashes were still damp with tears that had long since dried. Her lips parted but no sound came out. He spoke, his voice low and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, her voice so fragile it seemed as if her own name was a burden. In that moment, Grayson realized just how small she was. Not just physically, but in the way she held herself, as if life had taught her to be invisible, to take up no space. "How did you get into my room?" he asked again, still trying to assemble the illogical pieces. She explained she was a room service employee. Someone had told her to bring food to room 660, but the room numbers had been swapped. She didn't know it was his suite. She didn't know she had walked into a place meant for someone else. He studied her face, her trembling hands, the eyes that never dared to meet his, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't a game. It wasn't a setup, and she wasn't lying. No one could fake the stain on those sheets. No one would cry themselves to sleep in a billionaire's bed if they had planned it. She began to gather her clothes, avoiding his gaze. She said she would leave, begging only that he not report the incident, not destroy the little she had left. She moved toward the door, each step a silent plea to disappear. He could have let her go, could have turned away and filed this night under error. But something stopped him. Not pity, not desire. Something deeper, more unfamiliar. Just as her hand was about to touch the doorknob, he spoke. She froze, her fingers suspended in mid-air. When she turned to look at him, her expression was unreadable. He realized he was about to say something that no version of himself had ever rehearsed. Yet, the words came out. Steady, quiet, undeniable. "You're not going anywhere. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a command. It was a decision. And from that moment on, the lives of both of them would never be the same. In the days that followed, an unspoken agreement formed between them, without words or contracts. Their meeting place was the cold service corridors of the hotel, a neutral territory between his world and her reality. For Grayson, it began as an investigation. He told himself as much. Eva was an anomaly, a problem he needed to solve. He wanted to understand the logic behind her resilience, to analyze the structure of a life built from broken pieces. He listened to her stories, of scrimped meals, of long nights worrying about her younger brother, of small dreams eroded by reality. It was foreign data, impossible to quantify into profit or loss, yet it held an irresistible fascination. He didn't realize that in the process of analyzing the problem, he was being rewritten by it. For Eva, every meeting was a struggle. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, that men like him were storms that would sweep away and crush something as fragile as her. But then he would appear, not demanding, not judging, just standing there in silence with a black coffee in hand, and listening. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as a real, existing person, not a shadow passing by. And she found herself beginning to wait for those meetings. A feeling that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She was slowly lowering her defenses without even knowing it. And then, one day, he broke their rule. He didn't meet her in the corridor. He called her. His offer came through the phone, a request so absurd it was laughable. He wanted her to pretend to be his girlfriend for the weekend, at his family's annual charity gala. Eva laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Then panic set in. This was the storm she had always feared. He said he would pay her. The number he named was enough to cover Mateo's medical bills for an entire year. Her pride screamed a defiant number, but the image of her brother's weak smile silenced that scream. She was used to paying prices. This time, the price was a piece of her soul. To step into a world she despised, to play a part beside a man she didn't dare to define. She agreed. She had sold a piece of her silence in exchange for her brother's safety. The trip to the Wolf estate was like entering another world. The black SUV glided in silence over snow-covered roads, flanked by pine trees and mansions she had only ever seen in movies. She wore her only decent dress, feeling out of place and exposed. The Wolf estate was not a house. It was a castle, cold and majestic, with endless windows like watchful eyes. Grayson's grandmother greeted her with a politeness as cold as ice. His cousins stared at her like a strange object in a museum. And his father, the powerful man only just recovered from a stroke, studied her with an X-ray gaze that seemed to see right through to her poor origins and the hidden corners she tried to conceal. Eva didn't flinch. She had been fighting her whole life. This was just another battlefield. She smiled, stayed quiet, and remained close to Grayson. And he never left her side. His hand on the small of her back wasn't just the gesture of a lover in a play. It was an anchor. Occasionally, he would glance at her, a quick check to ensure she was still there, that his world hadn't swallowed her whole. It was a silent protection he didn't even realize he was offering. That night, after the speeches, the champagne, and the waltz she barely managed without tripping, he led her to the library. The room was silent, filled with books older than most nations. He pulled her onto his lap, a gesture of startling intimacy. He said, "Thank you." His voice was husky, not just for coming, but for not running. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the boy beneath the billionaire's armor. Someone tired, someone searching, someone who longed to be seen. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had been building inside her all weekend. He looked deep into her eyes. "Because you make me feel like I'm more than just an inherited name. You make me feel, for the first time, like I've earned something." Not bought. Not inherited. Earned. In that moment, Eva realized the performance was over. The feeling swelling in her chest was real. Later that night, in a guest room larger than her entire apartment, she stared at her reflection. She didn't see a maid or an imposter. She saw a woman who could be loved. And that was more terrifying than any of the scorn she had faced that evening. Part 3. Returning to the city didn't feel like a return to normalcy. The air between them had changed, now layered with a new, fragile intimacy. Their meetings no longer took place in the shadows of the service corridors. He invited her to his penthouse, a display of vulnerability that he himself hadn't anticipated. Standing amidst the cold, luxurious space, Eva felt more like a ghost than ever. But this time, it wasn't out of insecurity. It was from a strange urge, a yearning to know who she was, awakened by her encounter with a family as steeped in history and legacy as the Wolfs. She was just Eva. But before she was Eva, she was her mother's daughter, Maria Elena Carter. A name she rarely spoke, a memory carefully wrapped like an old wound. One night, while Grayson was absorbed in conference calls, Eva sat alone with his tablet. It wasn't curiosity, but an unexplainable impulse. She typed her mother's name into the search bar. A series of meaningless results appeared. But then, on the 5th page, a tiny line of text, buried in an old annual report from 20 years ago. Her mother's name, listed as a translator on a research project funded by a subsidiary of Wolf Dynamics. Eva's heart stopped. It had to be a coincidence. Thousands of companies, tens of thousands of projects. But then she read on. The report noted an unfortunate incident at the research site, resulting in the death of a civilian contractor, Maria Elena Carter. Cause: random accident. The room suddenly felt suffocating. The glass walls seemed to be closing in on her. Random accident. Those were the words they had used when she was just 10 years old. A soulless phrase to define the end of a child's entire world. When Grayson finished his call, he found her sitting motionless, her face ashen. He walked over, concern sharp in his eyes, an emotion he was still learning to name. "Eva, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. She simply turned the tablet screen toward him. Grayson looked at the screen. At first, he only saw numbers and text, but then he saw the name. And he saw it next to the name of his company. A horrifying absurdity. His first reaction was denial. A coincidence. A data error. His system didn't allow for such chaos to exist. But then he looked into Eva's eyes. He didn't see accusation. He saw a profound brokenness. A silent terror. He saw a 10-year-old girl looking at him, begging for an answer he didn't have. And a war tore through him. On one side was loyalty to his family, to the Wolf name, to the legacy he was born to protect. On the other was the woman sitting before him, the one who had entered his life as a mistake but was slowly becoming the only real thing in it. He could lie. He could say it was just a coincidence, that he would have someone look into it, and then bury it. That's what his father would have done. That's what a wolf was supposed to do. But looking at Eva's tear-filled eyes, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't build anything on a rotten foundation. He sat down beside her, not touching her, afraid his touch would only hurt her more. His voice was low and firm, but inside, his entire world was shaking. "I don't know anything about this," he said, and it was the truth. "But I promise you, I will find the answers. I will find all of them." That promise wasn't just for her. It was for him. He was a man of verifiable truths, and he could not live with a horrifying variable like this hanging between them. He had to know, even if that truth might burn his entire world to the ground. Eva said nothing, just gave a weak nod. That nod wasn't trust. It was a truce, a painful, suspended wait. That night, they slept on opposite ends of the bed. A cold, vast space between them. And in the darkness, Grayson made his first call, ordering an investigation into his own empire. He was taking a step into the shadows, with no idea just how deep and dark they truly were. Grayson's investigation was not a search for information. It was an excavation. Each file he opened was like a layer of earth being turned over, exposing the rot that had long festered beneath the foundation of the Wolf Empire. He worked in silence, mostly at night, when the city below was asleep and he was left alone to face the ghosts of his own family. The glass walls of his office no longer reflected a powerful leader, but a man being besieged by his own legacy. The resistance came quietly. Files were misplaced. Former employees suddenly became unreachable, and the calls from his father, his voice no longer commanding, but carrying a cold warning, an advisory to let the past lie. But Grayson couldn't. The image of Eva's shattered eyes was seared into his mind. It had become his new moral compass, something he never knew he needed. He was no longer fighting for profit or power. He was fighting for the ability to look her in the eye without feeling like he was part of the lie that had destroyed her life. And then, he found it. Not in a financial report, but in an encrypted memo, buried on a decommissioned server. A chain of emails between a high-level security director at Wolf Dynamics and a military officer. They didn't speak of an accident. They spoke of a leak. Maria Carter had discovered the true nature of the project, illegal testing on undocumented immigrants. She was going to talk. And they had resolved the issue. Grayson read the words over and over. Resolve the issue. A sterile, clean phrase used to cover up a human life. Eva's mother hadn't died in an accident. She had been silenced. Erased. A wave of nausea rose in him. Not explosive anger, but a deep, cold disgust. The castle he ruled was built on blood. The wealth, the power, the reputation of the Wolf family had all been watered with the silence of people like Eva's mother. He printed the documents, feeling the weight of each page like the weight of a tombstone. The confrontation with his father took place not in the boardroom, but in the estate's library, the very room where he had thanked Eva for not running away. Gregory Wolf sat there, by the fireplace, his cane beside his chair. He wasn't surprised to see the file on the table. He just looked at his son with a tired gaze. It was a different time, Gregory said, his voice flat. A necessary sacrifice for national security. Sacrifice? Grayson repeated, his voice terrifyingly quiet. You call murdering an innocent woman a sacrifice? It was collateral damage, Gregory replied, without a hint of remorse. If you want to throw away an empire for a translator who is paid pennies, then perhaps you're not strong enough to carry the Wolf name. In that moment, Grayson looked at the man who had raised him and no longer saw his father. He saw the decaying monument of a bygone era. He said nothing more. He just looked at his father one last time, then turned and walked away. The bond between them was severed, not with a shout, but with a bone-chilling silence. He would never be ruled by the rot that had built their empire. He returned to the apartment at midnight. Eva was still awake, curled on the sofa, a cold cup of tea on the table. She had been waiting. He said nothing, just placed the file in her hands. She read, her hands trembling, her face frighteningly blank. When she finished, she didn't cry. She just looked up at him, her eyes a deep, empty void. What now? She asked. It was the question that decided everything. He could bury it. They could leave. Live with this truth as a dirty secret between them. But he knew it would eat them from the inside out. I'm going to make it all public, he said. Each word a hammer blow to his own future. The company will admit responsibility. It will pay reparations. It will ruin you, she whispered. I know. It might not be enough. It still has to be done, he replied, his voice firm. Because your mother deserves justice. Because you deserve to live in the truth. Because sometimes, the only way to fix something is to break it first. The next day, an anonymous leak appeared online. A few hours later, Wolf Dynamics issued an official press release, confirming the authenticity of the documents and announcing a comprehensive internal reform. The news exploded. Investors panicked. The stock plummeted. The board demanded emergency meetings. But Grayson stood firm. He gave interviews, faced the razor-sharp questions, and not once did he deflect blame. When one reporter asked why he did it, he answered simply, "Because it was the right thing to do." He had made his choice. He had set his own bridge on fire. And in that inferno, he didn't know that enemies far more dangerous than financial ruin were beginning to stir in the shadows. While the financial world reeled from Grayson's actions, Eva found a strange sense of calm. Her mother's name had been cleared. The invisible weight she had carried for so many years, a burden so constant she had almost forgotten its existence, was lifted. She was no longer hiding. She applied to a university program for legal advocacy, a bold idea born from the very injustice her family had suffered. Her pain, for the first time, wasn't a shackle, it was a purpose. She told Mateo the whole truth about their mother, in the small apartment that no longer felt temporary. They cried together, not for the loss, but for a truth finally acknowledged. But darkness does not disappear just because you drag it into the light. Sometimes, it only grows angrier. Grayson's enemies began to stir in the shadows. Not business competitors, but those with too much to lose from the truth's exposure. Old partners, retired officials, men who had profited from the covered-up projects. And one man, in particular, had been waiting for this moment. Vincent Clean. The threat didn't arrive as a call or a letter. It came as a cold intelligence report on the desk of Grayson's security team. A credible threat, a detailed plan, targeting Grayson's upcoming speech at a tech conference in Chicago. That night, Eva confronted him. The newfound peace within her had vanished, replaced by a primal fear, the fear of loss. "Don't go," she begged, her voice breaking. "Justice doesn't have to mean your death. We've already won, Grayson." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep weariness but also an unshakable resolve. He took her hands, feeling them tremble. "If I back down now," he said softly, "everything I've done becomes meaningless. It would be an admission that I'm afraid. That justice can only be served when it's safe. But it's not, Eva. I have to go. I can't let them win." It wasn't the stubbornness of a billionaire, but the integrity of a man who had found his compass. He was no longer protecting an empire. He was defending his very soul. Eva stood at the airport gate, watching him board the plane. She wanted to run after him, to scream, to say the 3 words she had locked in her heart for fear that saying them would make everything too real, and the pain of loss even greater. But she just stood there, her hands cold, her heart tight. She could only watch helplessly as he disappeared into the crowd, and the sky prepared to swallow him whole. The bomb was sophisticated, designed to look like an electrical accident in the service elevator of the hotel hosting the conference. But the plan failed, not because of Grayson's elite security team, but because of a hotel maintenance worker, a man who had read the leaked documents and decided that silence was no longer an option. Grayson's actions had planted a seed, and it had sprouted in a place he never expected. The bomb was disabled. The bomber was arrested. And Grayson, unshaken, stepped onto the stage. He didn't just speak about technology. He spoke about accountability, about transparency, about the price of truth. His voice echoed through the hall, powerful and without a trace of fear. When the news broke, Eva was sitting in her apartment, clutching Mateo's hand. She began to cry, tears not just of fear finally released, but of overwhelming relief. For the first time in years, something good had survived. That night, Grayson came home. There was a small bruise on his cheek from a minor scuffle, but he was alive. The moment he walked through the door, Eva ran to him, throwing herself into his arms without a second of hesitation. No more questions. No more fear. Just the warmth of two people who had almost lost each other too many times. They just stood there, holding each other, in the silence of the apartment, while the world outside still roared. Weeks later, when the media storm had subsided, when their lives began to find a new, quiet rhythm. One morning, as sunlight streamed into the kitchen, she looked at him. A man making coffee as if it were the most normal thing in the world. This peace, she realized, was what she had always craved. And there was a secret she had held through all the chaotic weeks, a secret she hadn't dared to speak for fear it would be swept away in the storm. But now, the storm was over. "I think," she began, her voice as soft as a breath, "I'm pregnant." Grayson froze. He said nothing, just looked at her, his expression completely unreadable. The silence stretched for only a few seconds, but for Eva, it felt like an eternity. Then, he slowly walked over, reaching out not to hug her, but to gently take her hand. He looked directly into her eyes, and in his gaze there was no panic, no hesitation, only a deep acceptance and a promise more solid than steel. "Then," he said, his voice low and warm, "we'll do this together. Whatever it takes, we'll do it together." And in that quiet promise, something larger than pain, larger than legacy, began to form. Eva's confession hung in the air between them, not as a burden, but as a new truth that reshaped everything. Grayson reacted with an almost dangerous calm. He held her, kissed her forehead, and told her they would figure it all out. But Eva could see it in his eyes. A fleeting instability, carefully masked. It wasn't the fear of fatherhood. It was a deeper, more primal fear. The fear of failing at it. His entire life had been spent managing risk, building infallible empires. But now, he faced something no business plan could account for. Could he, a product of a toxic legacy, create a pure and safe life? Meanwhile, Eva felt the changes in her own body. Waves of nausea, a profound fatigue. She hated how vulnerable it made her feel, how the independence she had fought her whole life to maintain now had to bow to biology. But then, when she was alone, she would place a hand on her stomach, and a small flicker of warmth would bloom inside her, a feeling both terrifying and sweet. Their peace was temporary. A week later, Grayson received an anonymous tip. A shady asset transfer from the Wolf Foundation, linked directly to a shell company owned by Vincent Clean. But that wasn't the worst of it. Accompanying it was an old, yellowed birth certificate. Vincent Clean wasn't just a business partner. He was the illegitimate son of Grayson's grandfather. He was blood. A secret buried for decades. This truth hit Grayson harder than any stock market crash. The war he was fighting was no longer about justice for Eva's mother. It was about cleansing a bloodline that was rotten from the inside out. The man who tried to kill him was, by blood, his uncle. He didn't tell Eva everything at once. Not because he wanted to lie, but because he didn't know where to begin. How could he tell her that his family was even more toxic and twisted than they already knew? How could he place this additional burden on her shoulders, when she was carrying their child? But Eva sensed the weight on him. The sleepless nights, the sudden absences in their conversations. Finally, she confronted him. "What are you hiding from me?" And he told her the whole truth. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. She just sat there, listening in silence. Then she stood, walked into the bedroom, and locked the door. Not out of anger, but because her heart couldn't hold anymore. That night, she sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker like tired stars, thinking about the child inside her. She had fought so hard to escape her past, and now she was tied to a legacy even more twisted. The next morning, Grayson found her still sitting there, her eyes red. He sat beside her, saying nothing, just waiting. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice hoarse. I can't raise our child surrounded by ghosts. I need clean air, real earth. Not towers of glass and whispers in boardrooms. He nodded, understanding her even before she finished speaking. Within days, he had made arrangements. A quiet property upstate, far from headlines and history, with trees older than their ancestors and a porch that caught the morning sun. For a time, they found something close to peace. Ava walked barefoot in the grass, read to Mateo, and cooked meals that didn't come from delivery boxes. Grayson worked remotely, scaled back his hours, and for the first time, they began to dream about names, about colors for the nursery. But the past, as always, had other plans. One morning, while Eva was at a prenatal checkup, Grayson received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, but unmistakable. A teenage Eva, barely 15, standing next to a teenage boy, his hand gripping her wrist. The boy was Vincent's son. The photo was taken the week Eva had reported her assault. On the back, a scrawled message, "Your perfect girl has secrets too." Grayson's first instinct was disbelief. Then rage. Not at her, but at the man who sent it, the man who had dug into her past, using her trauma as a weapon. He waited for her to return. He watched her laugh with Mateo, and realized he couldn't keep the photo in his pocket any longer. That night, he showed it to her. At first, she just froze. Then she touched the photo with trembling fingers, her breath catching. And slowly, she told him everything. About how that boy was the first to hurt her. About how no one believed her. About how the system had failed her. About how she had buried it all, hoping it would never find her in the life she was trying to build. She thought he would walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he took her hands. And he said the words he had never said to anyone. "I love you. Not because you survived, but because you never stopped trying. And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Eva broke. Not with fear or shame, but with the overwhelming weight of being believed, of being seen. She cried in his arms, cried until the past no longer had the strength to stand between them. That weekend, they drove to the riverbank near their property. They dug a small hole and buried the photo beneath an oak tree. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just silence, and the quiet promise that their future would not be written by the ones who had tried to erase them. Spring arrived slowly in the Hudson Valley, soft and green, full of second chances. The trees outside their porch bloomed, one by one. The birds returned with quiet songs, and the world, for once, seemed to exhale. Eva moved more carefully now, her belly round and full of life. Every morning, she stood by the kitchen window, her hands resting just below her ribs, watching the wind play with the wildflowers. Sometimes, the weight of the past still rested in her chest, but it was no longer sharp. It was just a distant feeling, like a storm that had already passed. She had stopped asking herself if she deserved this kind of happiness, because she realized the answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen it. Grayson spent his mornings fixing small things around the house. Things that didn't really need fixing, but gave his hands a purpose. In the afternoons, he worked on a non-profit fund dedicated to supporting victims of wrongful prosecution and underrepresented legal cases. It was Eva's idea, but he insisted she be the co-founder. She tried to argue, but he simply reminded her that her story wasn't just pain, it was power. And if they were going to raise a child in a world full of broken systems, they would at least teach that child what it meant to try to change something. Mateo adapted faster than anyone. He made friends at the local school, brought home drawings of the family with lopsided smiles and bright suns. He called the baby the Bean, and the nickname stuck. Eva taught him how to bake from scratch. Grayson taught him chess. And together, they taught him that family wasn't built from blood or law, but from choice. On a quiet Sunday, with the clouds rolling slowly over the hills and the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, Eva went into labor. There was no panic, just a steady rhythm of breath and movement. Grayson stayed by her side, his voice the anchor she needed. Hours passed like minutes. And then, when the child arrived, their daughter was placed in Eva's arms, red and soft, and wailing as if the world had dared to keep her waiting. Eva cried quietly, not from pain, but from something deeper, a love so big it made her chest ache. Grayson stood over them, one hand on Eva's shoulder, the other gently cradling the tiny foot of the life they had created. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not legacy, not bloodlines, not headlines, just them. They named her Elena, after the woman who had given Eva everything, and had lost everything in return. As Eva whispered the name against her daughter's forehead, she felt a peace she had never known. Grayson leaned down and said, "Welcome home, little light." And Eva knew, in her bones, that the world would never be the same again. Months passed, then years. The house filled with memories. Birthdays with lopsided cakes. Mornings of laughter, coffee, and soft music. Long walks under the changing leaves. And every once in a while, when the stars were out and the children were asleep, Grayson and Eva would sit on the back porch, shoulders touching, hands intertwined, and talk about how far they had come. Not just from the city, or the scandal, or the pain, but from the versions of themselves that had once been afraid to believe in love. One night, as fireflies danced in the distance and the air smelled of wet earth, Eva said softly, "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" Grayson replied without hesitation, "I don't think the universe gives you what you want. I think it gives you what you're strong enough to fight for. And you, Eva, were worth every battle." She smiled, leaned into him, and whispered, "Then let's never stop fighting for it." And in the stillness that followed, with the moon high and the world quiet, two people who had once been broken sat side by side, finally whole. Not because they were perfect, but because they had chosen love, again and again, even when it hurt, even when it scared them. And that was more than enough.